Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Hyperabyssic Ontology, Part 12, The Production of Paradise. Finally, at the base and root of the tree of life is the Sephra Malkut, the kingdom of the phenomenal world, whose planetary attribution is appropriately the earth. Malkut is, however, not quite identical with what the physical sciences describe as reality. Rather, it represents the liminal boundary between subjective experience and physical objectivity, a domain overlapping both subject and object, yet not fully identical with either. In modern philosophy, I read Malkut as symbolizing what phenomenology calls the life world, a term that names the transcendental horizon of human existence, this being the semiotic structuring of hermeneutical assumptions and orientations that precede and guide our interpretation of the world as a world. According to the theory of the life world, human subjects are always already inseparably embedded within and involved with the interpretive domain constructed by the transcendental horizon of being. Edmund Husserl, for example, writes, quote, "The life world is always already there, existing in advance for us, the ground of all praxis, whether theoretical or extra-theoretical. The world is pre-given to us, the waking, always somehow practically interested subjects, not occasionally but always and necessarily as the universal field of all actual and possible praxis, as horizon," unquote. That's from The Crisis of the European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology. What is the basis of the transcendental horizon? How does it come about that it exists? God is a candidate for the theist. The atheist short answer is humanity. The latter is also Husserl's answer. Quote, "Universal intersubjectivity, into which all objectivity, everything that exists at all, is resolved, can obviously be nothing other than mankind." Unquote. Reading the phrase universal intersubjectivity in terms of Lacan's symbolic order allows the further clarification that language provides the causal medium of the life world. Language, like the life world it constructs, bridges the gap between subjectivity and objectivity. It is materially made by human organisms, who physically speak and write it in the external world of shared social activity, while at the same time it structures the conditions of the possibility for the inner mental experience of psychological subjects. In Lacanian terms, the social and external aspect of human language use is the symbolic, while the imaginary names the role of language in conditioning internal experience. Meanwhile, Lacan's third category of the real designates the fractured and incomplete character of language, both of its expressions as the symbolic and the imaginary, such that language remains fundamentally open to the human independent physical reality which language mediates human existence with. Yet, because this mediation functions metaphorically, the formulations of language can never achieve complete isomorphic identification with physical reality. Hence the utterly alien, even bizarre quality of the physical reality described by quantum mechanics and relativity theory, whether special or general, which use mathematical metaphors to successfully model reality. I write successfully in the sense that they predict the experimental validation of repeatable regularities, fulfilling the criterion for truth in the physical sciences, at least according to Karl Popper's verification hypothesis, regardless of how counterintuitive that truth is relative to our practical everyday experience. Reality is therefore not the same as the world, or more precisely, the clearing of being of the phenomenological life world disclosed by human being in the world, and yet through the mediation of language, the virtual reality of the latter is nevertheless produced and sustained by human activity from the material conditions of the former. Following the thread of the meditation on the relationship between reality and the world, if the traditional Platonic idealist notion of Malkut is that it is the endpoint of the tree of life's evolution from Kether, with Kether standing for the impossible real point of contact with the divinely supernatural pleroma, called God in the Kabbalistic tradition, and the One in Neoplatonism, then there is a useful dialectical materialist inversion of this reading. As a graphic image, the form of the tree of life has a curious feature. It appears that the root of the tree grows out of Malkut from the bottom of the tree, not from Kether at the top, so that from this perspective the emanation of the Sephiroth can be read in reverse of their usual order. In other words, viewed from the materialist perspective of Malkut as the root source of the tree of life, the symbolism of the tree represents how the ideal superstructure of the psychological Sephiroth, with their ontogenetic undergirding represented by the supernals, is based on and produced by the social material base of human being in the world represented by Malkut. Perhaps this dialectical inversion, or rather Kabbalistic equilibration, can contribute a fresh reading of MacGregor Mather's saying that Kether is in Malkut and Malkut is in Kether, but after another manner, which he adapted from Thomas Vaughan's alchemical maxim that the heaven is in the earth, but after an earthly manner, and that the earth is in the heaven, but after a heavenly manner. Mathers claimed that Vaughan is further quoting from Proclus, but typically does not provide some source citation. In alignment with the ultimately anthropological basis of the life world of Malkut, the correspondence of production to Malkut refers to the practical human social labor that constructs the transcendental horizon of the life world, in and through all of the diverse and concrete forms of intersubjectively cooperative socioeconomic activity that create and sustain human existence in all of its physical and virtual aspects. Karl Marx reminds us that life is not determined by consciousness, but consciousness by life. Furthermore, human life is material, which is to say socially and economically produced by human beings so that we form a dialectical feedback loop with ourselves. We produce our life world out of the available conditions of physical reality, and then our subjectivity is produced from the life world. As Marx writes, as individuals express their life, so they are. What they are, therefore, coincides with their production. Again, the mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. This means that implicitly, all the psychological functions symbolized by the Sephiroth of the Tree of Life are specialized modalities of social material production. However, although production is causative, and therefore determines what human beings are and what they can do, it does not follow that production is deterministic. Following Lacan's logic of the real, the world constructed by human production is necessarily incomplete, and therefore at least potentially modifiable by freely creative human activity, within the bounds permitted by physical reality, of course. And yet physical reality as such is also incomplete and open to being transformed through production. However, the ontological freedom inherent to the human production of the life world has primordially been obscured and covered over in history. Why has this been the case? Why, for example, do billions of people currently live in poverty in the midst of an advanced technological society that has developed to the point where it could in principle provide for everyone's needs? Marx attempts to answer these questions when he writes, quote, "How far the productive forces are developed is shown most manifestly by the degree to which the division of labor has been carried. Furthermore, the various stages of development in the division of labor are just so many different forms of ownership, which determines also the relations of individuals to one another." Unquote. In other words, the freedom of human beings to shape and craft their world in accord with their deepest creative drive, their true will in thelemic terms, has been alienated from them due to the arbitrary and unequal distribution of power within existing society. Not only that, but the symbolic order acts to reify these relations by normalizing and justifying them. And this reification is psychologically internalized through the imprinting of the imaginary in terms of the ideologically prevailing form of the symbolic. Through this process, the world we have collectively created for the fulfillment of our authentic will appears instead in the form of an alien tyranny set over and against us, inauthentically forcing us to restrict our desires. As it is written in the book of the law, the word of sin is restriction. Lacan names the personified form adopted by the tyranny of alienation the big other, a literary allusion to George Orwell's Big Brother. Whether this takes the shape of God, the state, the father, the bully, or the boss. However, Lacan also insists that there is no big other. The figure of authority that must be obeyed is an ideological fiction whose power is ultimately an illusory social construction. This is always the case because of the ontology of the real, which grasps that the symbolic order that establishes ideology is inherently incomplete and therefore impotent to totalize itself. Aleister Crowley's name for the function of the real is the Kabbalistic zero, whose gnosis liberates the creative drive of the true will. There is always implicitly an alternative to alienation, and it is the operative power of magic to make this existential option explicit. According to the Chinese classic The Great Learning, the journey of 1,000 leagues begins with taking a first step. Likewise, it teaches that before we can change the world, we must begin by changing ourselves. The path of theurgic initiation, symbolized by the Tree of Life, offers a way to break out of the vicious circle of the static presuppositions determined by the symbolic order. By first taking responsibility to liberate ourselves, we begin to play our part in the larger liberation of humanity. Then, and only then, do we make ourselves available to participate in the larger and more complicated social emancipatory projects that become possible when free people come together to cooperate in community. In a Kabbalistic context, the myth of the fall and restoration, or tikkun, of the Garden of Eden offers a rich symbolic template to interpret these themes. Eden corresponds to Malkut, at least before the fall. From the traditional metaphysical perspective of Platonic dualism that provides the cultural context of the Zohar and other medieval Kabbalistic sources, physical materiality as such, called prime matter or Heil in Greek philosophy, is properly represented by the level below Malkut, that of the klipoth or shells. Prime matter is entirely inert on its own, and only when it is infused with the spiritual Platonic forms does it become animate and assume the shape of nature. In Hebrew mythology, this shadowy domain of unbalanced forces was originally separated from the Garden of Eden, the sacred creation and bride of Yahweh dwelling in Tifereth, symbolized by the Shekinah, the feminine aspect of the divine corresponding to Malkut. After the fall at the beginning of time narrated in Genesis, the klipoth broke free of its proper bounds and corrupted Eden, transforming it into the world of history where good and evil are mixed. Tikkun, the theurgic mission of Kabbalistic mitzvot, or ritual observance, aims at the healing redemption of the klephotic shells that have become mixed with the world, and the return of the union between Yahweh and the Shekinah. On the Tree of Life, Tikkun is symbolized by the restoration of communication between Malkut and Tifereth, mediated by Yesod. The ascent to Tifereth along the middle pillar is further facilitated by the balancing of the two pillars of the tree, whose bases are in Hod and Netzach. In Thelemic magic, this process is encapsulated by the motif of the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel, whose name in the holy books of Thelema is Adonai, the stand-in for Yahweh. Within the Garden of Eden, Eve represents the Shekinah, which after the fall wanders the earth in exile in company with and embodied as the community of Israel. As a result, Lilith, the klipoth corresponding to Malkut, replaces Eve for a time as Adam's consort. In Kabbalistic lore, their offspring populate the world with various lesser demonic and spectral entities, like the monsters in Greek mythology, sometimes said to have been sired by the Titans prior to the reign of the Olympian pantheon. The symbolic opposition between Eve and Lilith implies an esoteric correlation between the twin figures, where they stand for different aspects of the same divine figuration. Lilith, in other words, is the material or lower aspect of the divine feminine, whose higher aspect is represented by Eve. On the Tree of Life, these twin light and dark aspects of the goddess correspond to Bina Neshama as the celestial Eve, who is also the woman clothed with the sun depicted in the book of Revelations, while Lilith is the Shekinah in Malkut, who is in exile from the divine due to the fallen, incomplete condition of the world. According to the teachings of the Zohar, Binary gender as constructed by patriarchy did not exist prior to the creation of Eve as a being separate from Adam. It is implied that the primordial Adam was in some sense physically hermaphroditic or intersex while dwelling in Eden. The hermeneutical presuppositions for this line of interpretation derive in part from the exegetical impulse to reconcile apparent discrepancies between the two different creation myths recounted in Genesis. In the first, it states that in the image of God he created them, male and female he created them, Genesis 1:27. Then in the second creation myth, it is said that God created Adam alone in the Garden of Eden, Genesis 2:7. Where are both the males and females referred to earlier in the text? The Zohar resolves this obscurity by proposing an esoteric interpretation. The Adam was originally created both male and female in one body. The expression used by the Zohar is that the Adam is male and female as one, not separated to be face to face. Instead of being positioned face to face as two bodies in erotic embrace, the genders of male and female are represented as being side by side in one body, akin to the twin pillars of the tree of life which form the sides of Adam Kadmon, the celestial body of God out of whom the Sephiroth are fashioned. The text also describes how in Adam, quote, all was as one in consummation, male and female. The female cleaved to his side until he, God, cast sleep upon him, and he slumbered lying on the side of the temple below. The temple below is the site of the Shekinah, which is also Eden and Malkut, as well as the sacred precincts of the tabernacle in the wilderness and of the Jerusalem temple. The text continues, the Blessed Holy One sought him, adorned her as one adorns a bride, and brought her to him. In these passages, the Zohar draws a literary comparison between the Adam and the people described in Plato's Symposium, which playfully proposes that humans were first created by the gods with two front sides positioned back to back. When these early human beings became too aggressive, the gods cut them in half, creating two persons out of one. As a result, they were distracted from causing too much trouble by love because, quote, when the work of bisection was completed, it left each half with a desperate yearning for the other, always trying to reintegrate our former nature, to make two into one, and to bridge the gulf between one human being and another, unquote. Based on this intertextual reference, the Zohar makes a pun on the Hebrew word tselah, meaning side, and translated rib in the King James Bible, where the text of Genesis narrates how the Elohim fashioned Eve out of the Adam's side while they were asleep, Genesis 2:21-22. As the word can also refer to the sides of a piece of wood being hewed apart, the Zohar describes God sawing the Adam in half like a woodcutter to create the first occurrence of sexual difference, like one of Plato's androgynes getting chopped in half. However, their initial experience of sexual difference remains ambiguous for Adam and Eve. It is not yet experienced by them as equivalent to patriarchal binary gender dimorphism. Only after eating the forbidden fruit does gender become fully manifest in its historically recognizable form, based on the division of labor in the patriarchal family, an economic class system that explicitly does not exist in the primitive communism of the utopian paradise of Eden. From a Lacanian psychoanalytic point of view, the myth of the androgyne Adam clearly alludes to the artificiality of the gender categories imposed through socialization within patriarchal society. The Oedipal trauma symbolized in the myth by the Adam being sawn apart like a log of wood stands for the loss of primordial infantile narcissism through the linguistic construction of psychological subjectivity in terms of the gendered social roles established by the patriarchal symbolic order. Becoming gendered is the loss of Eden, even while this loss is at the same time of an unrecoverable fantasy, an impossible real deadlock whose solution lies in the creative permutation of diversely gendered experience. It is impossible for the linguistically structured psyche to have access to ungendered experience. Once symbolic difference of any kind exists for the psyche, it is infused with affectivity and therefore libidinized. The diversity of sexual difference cannot be transcended, only realized through either authentic or inauthentic modes of intersocial being. The choice of which modes we actualize is ultimately ours, no matter how historically alienated our ability to recognize our choice becomes. Based on the logic of myth that what is earlier is better, the Zohar argues that the asexual primordial condition was superior to the fixed binary gender identities enforced in historical patriarchal societies. These latter conditions are bound up with what separates human beings from their originally Edenic condition. The Zohar states that, quote, one who is not both male and female is called half a body. No blessing adheres in anything lacking or defective, but only in a complete place, a complete thing, not half a thing. Half a thing can never endure and never be blessed, unquote. It needs to be emphasized, however, that the initially genderless condition of the Adam, posited by the Kabbalah, is a mythological utopian projection that does not and cannot exist within historical societies. Within history, non-binary modes of gender expression are also genders. And while binary symbolizations of gender can definitely be critiqued, modified, and contextually partially transcended through the positing of other possible social categories of sexual difference as such cannot be directly transcended because human expressions of sexuality are always already irreducibly diverse. For example, if there were only one mode of non-gendered sexual self-expression, it would still be a gender. Indeed, it would symbolically simply take the place of the male gender in patriarchy, with those who failed to conform to its norms being cast in the role of the other sex, corresponding to the female position. And so such a hypothetical society would simply find itself cast back to a system of binary gender. Semiotically, there being no genders is equivalent to there being one gender, and this one gender being necessarily incomplete in terms of the real, it is directly equivalent to there being two genders, namely the normative sex that is one, and the other sex that is different from the one, or male and female, regardless of what these are renamed. I would propose that the Kabbalistic myth of a non-gendered human existence preceding the fall be constructively interpreted in terms of Lacan's concept of the real. By postulating an impossible real state of genderless existence before history, impossible because human existence is always within history, although not necessarily the kind of history we experience as modern subjects, this Kabbalistic teaching operates to relativize all historical systems of sexual difference representable by the symbolic order, making it impossible to fix and essentialize their categories. Genderlessness is the condition of the real that resists representation absolutely, and that occupies the place of Lacan's barred subject. During his famous seminars, he would draw the symbol of the barred subject on the blackboard as a capital letter S with a bar drawn diagonally across it. His point was that the subject is normatively barred from being able to psychologically totalize itself in terms of itself. While existing, we are always already historical beings, projecting upon possibilities that remain outstanding in whole or in part. Only in death is our phenomenon completed, at least as a personal event for the subject in question. In place of the presence of the real, we live out our historicity in terms of the shared virtual fantasy of sexual difference within the phenomenological life world we call society. Yet in and through its very absence, the genderless real is present as a transcendental horizon, relativizing the conditions of all possible gendered experience within the life world. Thereby, the fixed becomes volatile and alchemically mutable, such that the restrictive binary gender coding of the patriarchal symbolic order can potentially be open to creative permutation. This is the liberative project proposed by Aleister Crowley for the new eon, whose magical formula, he says, is that of two sexes in one person, which serves as his queer thelemic restatement of the Kabbalistic reading of Genesis 1:27, that humans are male and female in one body. Crowley was familiar with the Kabbalistic interpretation of the verse through the Zoharic text, the Sidra Idra, or Lesser Holy Assembly, a translation of which was included in S.L.M. Mather's The Kabbalah Unveiled, a work that Crowley prized highly, which he habitually took with him to study in his tent while mountain climbing. His contextually appropriate queer reading of the formula of two sexes in one person obviously does not impede trans, intersex, straight, and other diverse interpretations. Readers are encouraged to innovate based on their personal circumstances while working with the magical formula in question. In the Sidra Idra of the Zohar, it is written, quote, "The female cleaves to the side of the male until she is separated from his side and comes to join with him face to face. When they join, they appear as really one body. From here we learn a male alone appears as half a body, entirely compassion, the right-hand pillar of mercy, Hesed of the tree of life, though split, incomplete, and similarly a female. When they join as one, all appears as one body. Really, so it is. Here too, when the male joins with the female, all is one body, and all the worlds are joyful, for they are blessed by a complete body. This corresponds to the mystery. Therefore Yahweh blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it, Exodus 20:11, for all constituted one complete body. Matronita, cleaving to the king, becoming a single body. Therefore blessings prevail on this day." Unquote. There are multiple methods for accomplishing the magnum opus of the reconstitution of the complete body, and with it the restoration of Eden and the sacralization of the life world. Clearly, the two pillars must be equilibrated, so that all the Mesla, or divine influences of the Upper Sephiroth, are poured through Yesod into Malkut. Yet how this works out concretely in terms of gendered experience is ambiguous and open to interpretation. In the passage cited above, for example, the obvious sex-magical reading runs the danger of missing the point that while the text definitely endorses marital intercourse as a sacred activity, sexual love is also meant to serve as a metaphor for the ritual observance of the Sabbath, not just the other way round. The Sabbath, and by extension all Torah observance, is for the Jewish Kabbalist the theurgic means for invoking the sacred into everyday life. This is experienced as equivalent to restoring Eden and rebuilding the temple. For example, when a group of Jewish men get together for prayer and Torah study, their minyan becomes the Shekinah and the bride of Yahweh. The men are thereby symbolically feminized and manifest the complete body described by the Zohar. This means that the Shekinah's feminine signification cannot be essentialized any more than the symbolization of maleness associated with Yahweh. Unlike other more closed systems of discourse, such as Christian evangelical exegesis, Kabbalistic symbolism is hermeneutically open, and it consistently solicits diverse interpretations of its source materials. Love is the law, love under will.